Well, today on No Nonsense with Pamela Wallin, a conversation not only about politics, but about those who cover politics. And more than that, the process of covering politics, because it really, really has changed, certainly in my professional lifetime. Paul Wiles, 30 years reporting on politics one way or another, almost 20 at Maclean's magazine, a magazine that for more than 100 years has been a staple of writing and journalism and has produced a lot of great writers and journalists. But its legacy, its traditional media, as we say, and it's undergoing a transformation, and so are many of the people who spent their life in that business, myself included. So Paul Wiles is with us today. He has just left Maclean's magazine to invent a whole new online media world. What are you doing?
So the short answer, and it's funny because I've got a lot of people who have followed and enjoyed my recent moves, and they can't figure out a vocabulary for it because it's a new media thing. The short answer is I have a subscription newsletter. Right. The people can find it on the internet at paulwells.substack.com. Substack is the platform on which a bunch of independent writers are getting their stuff out to their audiences.
Right. A lot of good stuff.
The idea is that you can subscribe to me the way you used to subscribe to the places that hired me. We're essentially cutting out the middleman. And the journalism that I'm doing, I launched in the middle of April. So a little more than 2 months in, is very similar to the work that I did at Maclean's during the years when I was happiest at Maclean's. Strongly centered on covering the federal government, politics. But I also write about the arts and culture because that stuff's important to me. And I also write about basically the state of journalism. Yeah. And the through line is I write about the things that I find interesting. And hopefully there's a public that also finds that interesting, and they just kind of trust me to find things that are worth reading and talking about.
I will declare my conflict here is I instantly subscribed to you when you emerged on Substack. So I think it does work in that sense, because I think many people, if I am to read my email and my Twitter, and I just hear from a lot of people, and this is a larger question, they really don't trust what they read in the mainstream media anymore, and they're looking for many different ways to try and inform themselves. That trust question is a big one, Paul.
Yeah, I mean, so there's two things. There's trust and there's capacity. Capacity is who can afford to pay journalists anymore, and you know that led to my
the government
old job.
Of Canada, apparently.
Yeah, my old job at Maclean's was sort of shrinking over time. One time I was in Toronto for some meetings in the newsroom. This is a few years ago. And there was an old whiteboard with notes from a editorial staff meeting that someone had forgotten to wipe clean. And I looked, you know, so-and-so is working on this and so-and-so is working on that. And almost everyone on that whiteboard had left. Almost everyone on that whiteboard had moved on or been laid off or left journalism or gone to work at the Corp or the Globe or the few places where there was work. So it became less and less clear to me why I was hitching my wagon to a large news organization that was no longer large. The other thing, is what you mentioned, which is trust. And I sort of want to be careful here. I didn't launch my thing as a critical broadside of the assumptions of mainstream journalism. I'm not, to coin a phrase, I'm not a rebel. I'm not. I think the stuff I've always thought. My opinions have not substantially changed on big questions, but there has been an erosion of trust in large news organizations anyway, for a few reasons. One thing you alluded to, which is the federal government's decision to increase government subsidies of news organizations, which I take to be well-intentioned, and I have always believed was a catastrophically bad decision. because the amount of money they're giving out
Exactly.
is not going to save any doomed large
Right.
organization. It's going to be just enough money to shatter people's faith that we're calling them as we see them. And so I do think it matters to a lot of my subscribers that that there's no hidden strings. I'm paid by my readers. I'm not paid. As far as I know, there's no government program that would help me. I haven't asked for one. I'm not going cap in hand to the people that I cover. But even then, there's just a more antagonistic relationship between people who produce news and the people who consume it. When you were on the National, I'm sure you were getting angry emails all the time. But there was still a kind of a sense that if it was on the TV, it had to be true. And people are much less convinced of that now.
No, I think that really is different. I mean, I've spent a lot of years, and I'm now about 20 years out of date in terms of the journalism business, having gone off to New York as consul general, come back into the Senate. So I look at it much more as a consumer now. But you also, in a sense, could more easily trust what you saw. There was a merging of newsrooms, and this has its dangers too. But at the end of the day, you could watch CTV, or you could watch CBC, or you could read a newspaper, and you would kind of know the important stuff that happened that you needed to know about, whether Russia was winning or Ukraine was winning, whether, the prime minister just fell down a set of stairs or announced. Now you just don't know necessarily what you're going to get on the front page or the lead of the newscast, because they're taking that clickbait mentality and trying to transfer it to that kind of journalism, that kind of format, and it doesn't work.
Yeah. It used to be so easy to make money off of advertising.
Right.
That people in our line of work were basically swimming in cash. The first time I submitted as a very young reporter at the Montreal Gazette, the first time I submitted an expense account claim, the section editor who was going to have to pay those expenses laughed at me for having asked for so little money.
You hadn't added the claim. Yes.
It was like I gave him a $60 hotel bill, and he yelled across the newsroom. He swore at me, and he said, "What kind of flea bag motel were you staying in, Wells?"
Yeah.
Now, you
got to take a tent.
The last thing I filed for Maclean's, which they declined to publish, my last column, was an interview with good old Stephen Del Duca, who was the Liberal leader in Ontario. Mm. And I figured I should have the decency to sit at a table with him and look him in the eye before I made fun of him. and so I went to Toronto on my own dime, because I wasn't sure whether I didn't know whether my organization had a travel budget for me. And I thought, well, what the hell? I'm well paid. Off I go. And so that's a tiny indication of the declining health of the whole industry. And I don't think it's on the scale of human tragedy. The fact that we don't have nice expense accounts anymore is pretty modest. Yeah. But it also constrains our ability to do important work in important ways. And one of the nice things about what I'm doing now with this newsletter is that people are happy to pay, and I'm going to have money to get on a plane and go to a story.
You did, I think last week, you did an interview with Jean Charade. He's going to say yes to you because he's known you for 30 years and you've known him. That he was once in Ottawa and leader of a party and all of those things. So for now, you're going to get the response from people. And you think that even without being attached to an organization with a big name, that will still continue?
As of today, I have 6,000 subscribers, not paid subscribers.
Yeah.
A subset within that 6,000, there's 6,000 people who signed up to get an email from me every time I publish something.
Yeah.
And that includes members of every political party, political strategists, deputy ministers. Those are useful eyeballs for a newsmaker to get in front of. Yes, which means that when I ask for, I also interviewed Rachel Notley. I've got a couple of more interviews with significant newsmakers coming up soon, because
they need to target their audience too.
Yeah, a national newscast has a larger audience, but it's a distracted audience. Yeah. It's an unimpressed audience. People who subscribe to me are news junkies, and in a lot of cases, decision makers themselves. And so it's really useful for me as I try and get access to busy politicians and nervous politicians, because they know that sometimes I'm not gentle. They also know that it's a chance to speak through me to those 6,000 and growing subscribers.
Okay, so I want to talk about some of those people that are watching and reading, and some of those people that want to talk to the people that are watching and reading on that. I'm going to just take let's start with Jean Charade. What do you think? People are going all over the map here. Why did he come back? He had a successful career. The people that are running the Conservative Party are young enough that they don't remember when Jean Charade was leader of the PC party. What did you make of his reasons for doing what he's doing?
It's funny. I'm not sure Charade has ever taken part in a leadership campaign when it was his idea. It was real obvious in 1998 when he left federal politics to go to Quebec politics. It was clear that he was essentially dragged by the Quebec Liberal establishment. And pushed by the federal Liberal establishment.
Yeah, take one for the team. Yep.
Yeah, and he was. I ran into him at an airport at that time. He was not a happy camper. I just read a memoir by William Thorsell, the former Globe and Mail editor, who talks about the Conservative leadership in 1993 when Charade ran against Kim Campbell and nearly beat her. He didn't even want to run. Brian Mulroney put him up to it to fill out the field so it wouldn't look like a Campbell coronation. And again, similarly now, I'm not sure he was super interested in leaving a comfortable retirement and a cushy corporate consulting gig to do this. But a lot of progressive conservatives and fiscal conservatives have been feeling, they weren't entirely comfortable in Stephen Harper's Conservative Party, and they've been feeling increasingly uncomfortable since. And they want to test the question of whether there's room for people like them in today's Conservative Party. Yeah. And Charade is obviously, my first question to him was, say you win, can you even lead this party?
No, exactly.
And you said are you still sitting with the Conservative caucus?
No, I am not. Yeah. Okay. I am part of the Canadian Senators group, and we are a ragtag bunch that cover all. No, I have no affiliation.
Okay, that's probably the most comfortable place to be. Although being in the Conservative caucus in Senate is interesting because they're part of the National Conservative Caucus.
Yeah,
and that National Conservative Caucus has large numbers of people who met with the truckers' convoy in February.
Yep.
Are pretty sure that the World Economic Forum is
running the world.
Yeah, and then so say Charade manages to become their leader. Even then, could he be their leader? And he didn't really answer that question because I'm not sure it's possible to answer.
I don't think. Yeah,
that's the question that Charade poses by his existence right now.
So we're seeing it in Alberta, and we're seeing it on the federal stage, and it is kind of the question. I know an awful lot of Brian Mulroney conservatives, or red Tories, or progressive conservatives, or whatever the titles are. They're just not this. not the party that we see in the House of Commons every day. So what's the long haul on that? Let's just say Pierre Poilievre wins. I don't think that's a given, but let's say he does. He's pretty clear where he is on the scheme of things. So what happens to all those people that were red Tories and don't find a home? They're not going to go and join the Liberal ranks at this point.
Maybe they just stay home and sit on their hands. Maybe they're bluffing, including to themselves, and they would, in fact, stick with a Conservative Party. Maybe, say, Poilievre becomes the leader. There's a million ways he can play out his first month as the leader, and it could be ways to say, "Come one, come all." You know, if he were to. I don't know. You know, if he were to invite Jean Charade to be his deputy prime minister, if he were to, you know, and so on and so on.
And he's a pro-choice guy. He says
Poilievre is secretly, by recent Conservative standards, quite a moderate on a bunch of questions. I mean, not secretly, but he doesn't trumpet it.
No, exactly.
He doesn't support conversion therapy for young trans people. He doesn't. He's pro-choice on the abortion question. Although, during an extraordinarily turbulent time in that debate, with historic and unnerving things happening in the United States, he hasn't said a word. Right? You know, so sometimes it's hard to tell where Poilievre stands on these questions. But and if he were to do what Harper did, which was Harper was seen as an angry Western conservative, but he reached out to progressive conservatives like Bruce Carson to write his platform and Marjorie Le Breton to help run a campaign tour and things like that, then that would be a signal to the different factions in the Conservative Party that the leader doesn't have a problem with him. I mean, you know, I don't know, but I talked to everyone, and some progressive conservatives I've spoken to honestly surprised. First of all, it's surprising that people still self-identify as progressive conservatives. 16 years after that, you know, 18 years after
that party has disappeared.
Yeah, but they sure feel like progressive conservatives now because they don't feel like the center of the current Conservative Party.
So you're the most recent thing you've read. I'm grabbing some bits and pieces just so people get a sense of what you're thinking and what you're writing about. So your latest piece is called Red Team, the Red Team. How would you act if you wanted this government to thrive, meaning the Trudeau government, and why can't this government act like that?
Yeah. So
got an answer for that question?
If I had an answer, I'd probably be
you'd be brought into the PMO to try.
Yeah, but the genesis of it is that this government has taken really kind of an unusually tough battering from journalists and commentators over the last few weeks. And a large part of it is over the chaos in passport offices and airports.
Right.
And then on the weekend, the Prime Minister said, well, look, don't you worry. I've got it fixed. I'm going to appoint a cabinet committee to improve the delivery of government services. And I don't know anyone who reacted to that by saying, yeah,
hey, that's how we're going to fix it.
Government cabinet committee, now everything's going to be fine. I mean, an awful lot of people, including lifelong liberals, looked at that news and they said, what are you doing? You know, you can't fix a process problem with more process. You can't solve the future with cabinet ministers who most people couldn't pick out of a police lineup and who have never been known to, you know. And so I said, well, so red team, the red team. The red team obviously is the Liberals. And generically, the red team idea is sometimes big organizations bring in a team of outside expert observers to find all the weaknesses and all the flaws in the organizational structure. And I think it's past time for Justin Trudeau to start doing something like that.
It is.
Turn to someone he trusts and say, why is it not working? But
dozens of Liberals have said to me, and I'm sure to you over the last 7 or 8 years, we have phoned, we have volunteered, we've said, we've seen that movie, that crisis before, we can come in and help you. And the answer is no, we're the new world here, and we don't need advice or gray hair or help. So I don't know if they would let the red team in to help the red team.
Yeah. So, and he's absolutely free to just putter on the way he's been doing. There's an election in 3 years, and he might win it, and he might get his teeth handed to him, but with an eye to that election, it might be time to start making some big decisions now. That's the top of this latest piece, which is I point out that a decade ago, in July of 2012, there was a prime minister who was making small changes in the face of big challenges. And there was a pretender who was having meetings with his friends and associates to plot that prime minister's downfall. Mm-hmm. Prime minister a decade ago was named Stephen Harper. The pretender a decade ago was Justin Trudeau, who met at Mount Tremblant with Jerry Butts and Katie Telford, Navdeep Bains, and Tom Pitfield, and a bunch of others, to say, here's what's not working with that government. Here's how we're going to turn it to our advantage to destroy that government. And having done that, while another guy was prime minister, while the other guy was oblivious to the threat coming at him, surely Justin Trudeau is capable of imagining that somebody else is plotting against him
doing the same
right
thing
now,
either within his party or without. Like,
exactly. I mean, look, it's like everyone knows that Pierre Poilievre is making plans past the Conservative leadership.
Exactly.
And Trudeau can't imagine somebody like Poilievre getting the keys to the car. But just as Stephen Harper couldn't imagine the country trusting Justin Trudeau, you always get beat by the person you despise. But as I say, and as you just said, who's to say it's only Conservatives who are plotting against Trudeau? I mean, at some point, someone's going to start doing what Paul Martin did back in the day, which is,
there just seems to be that. You've used some phrases, you always have a nice turn of phrase, but describing the prime minister, he seems trapped inside a tiny vocabulary of thought and action. There is exhaustion, risk aversion, and denial. And that is kind of what people are seeing, including members of his own cabinet.
Yep. And if he tries and fails, and after all, what he's trying to do is like super hard, super rare. He's trying to win a fourth consecutive election. Yeah. Since Confederation, it's now becoming something that people who are plugged into politics know and can recite this fact. The only prime ministers who've ever won 4 in a row were John MacDonald and Wilfrid Laurier. So it's a century since the last guy won a four-peat.
Yeah.
There's no rule of physics that says that the third prime minister to win a fourth consecutive election can't be Justin Trudeau. But that shows the scale of the challenge.
Yeah.
And if he says, no, we're fine, we're okay, and then he loses, he'll have the rest of his life to hear people laughing at him.
Yeah. I do think, these are the folks that brought you deliverology, right? And this is what they were going to do. They were going to be efficient. And you kind of look and say, okay, but people at the passport office have to go to work because you can't actually deliver a passport from your own living room. Like, these things are not rocket science. These are not tough questions to figure out. There are many out there that are tough, but some of this basic government as service delivery. That should be able to be done.
Yeah. So I didn't actually write this in the piece because
bonus content, people, bonus content. Okay, go ahead.
I don't think it necessarily always has to be brought down to personalities. But if the prime minister were to fire his chief of staff and bring in a new chief of staff, that would be an indication that he understands the scale of the difficulty he's in.
Yeah.
And like that's so cheap that everyone runs to, well, he's got to get rid of Katie Telford. But after 6.5 years, when almost every announcement they make that sounds like a promise of change gets laughed at because people understand that these people don't change, that's a real problem. And you don't fix it. You don't fix it by announcing a cabinet committee on a Saturday morning. You know?
A more strategic review of the strategy that was in place to review. No, there's just an awful lot of that kind of jargon, and there's already the knock on them for endless virtue signaling, and you buy some of that through tough times like COVID. But now we're trying to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. It can't just be virtue signaling. It actually has to be not just announcement, but results from announcements.
Yeah. And this government has successes that it can point to. They survived Donald Trump's presidency pretty well. They rescued NAFTA from really, really drastic change. They, after a really slow, pokey start, they got that large majority of Canadians who wanted to be vaccinated. They got us all vaccinated. But one thing they keep doing is thinking that they know what's going to happen next, and then getting wrong. Like the idea that we could build back better from a pandemic was based on a set of assumptions that just have not been borne out. That governing would somehow get easier after a global catastrophe. That people who disagreed with the Liberals would just go away, and everyone would kind of wake up and, oh, I see, the Liberals of Canada have been right all along.
Right.
And
or that you could spend billions of dollars and not have inflation.
Yeah. And that things like supply chains and workplaces wouldn't be profoundly rattled, not just at a functional level, but at kind of an emotional level, indefinitely going forward. So I keep reminding this crew that their first reaction to the terrible COVID outbreak was to get excited because they thought it would make their jobs easier. And you don't even have to get outraged at that on a moral level. You just have to notice that's really bad forecasting.
Yeah.
I
can't think of anybody sitting in a hospital that would have ever had that thought. Wow.
Well, this is it. And so what you need to do is have a government that's lighter and nimbler and can respond more quickly to surprise. And this government is just constantly moving in the other direction. It's getting heavier and slower and taking longer to make decisions. And we're starting to see the cost of that.
Well, and the other thing, and this is inevitable, I mean, this government started out with some mini scandals like going off to the Aga Khan and that sort of thing, or even blackface to some extent. But now it's getting a little bit more fundamental in the sense of, why did you invoke the Emergencies Act, and did the cops ask for it or not? How you're dealing, it's a small thing, but it represents a large thing. Why is a Canadian diplomat going to a Russian party? There's just a bunch of symbolic things that may not be, we're going to, forbid the production of plastic bags and straws, but we can't get energy to our neighbors or to ourselves or to countries in Europe that might need it because we're focused on one. I don't know whether that's ideological and philosophical or whether there's a level of, as you say, an ability to see the big picture, and certainly some incompetence, or you can't shift the big machine. Where do you come down on some of those questions?
Well, there's a bunch of layers to that. I mean, there's almost this sort of sporting question of, do they win or not at the next election?
Yeah.
But Trudeau himself used to say that the stakes were bigger than that. I mean, in the 2014 Liberal convention in Montreal, which was their last convention before they ended up winning the 2015 election, the Liberals sat through a speech from Justin Trudeau where he said, essentially, this Harper crew is so bad at governing that they're eroding faith in government. They're taking away people's sense that all that money they send to Ottawa could ever do anything useful for them. And that if people start to think that that the social contract is not being fulfilled by mainstream governments and political parties, then they're going to start looking around for extreme options. And that's what he was saying in 2014 from an opposition seat where it's easy to be more critical, but he wasn't wrong. And we've seen examples. I mean, to some extent, the election of Donald Trump is what happens when an electorate gets frustrated with the sense that traditional political leaders can't actually give them anything.
And Obama gives you a Trump and vice versa.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot of culprits for the rise of Trump, but I've been more and more critical. Well, not more and more critical. Basically, I went from being not particularly critical of this government in the latter half of 2018. I started to sort of be on their back a lot more. But my message is never, you're the wrong kind of Canadian, or I want my team back.
Yeah.
Because I don't pick a government that's above my pay grade. People send me any kind of government they want, and then I just write about them. But my message to Liberal is much more, this is my generation of Canadian leadership. I've known most of these people for more than 20 years. And my message to them is, you have an obligation to the truth, to the electorate, and to the notion that government can be good for something. So you should be good for things. And when I just endlessly chronicle things they promise are going to happen that doesn't happen, programs they promise will work that don't work, it's because this is going to sound egotistical, but what the hell? Someone's got to be a conscience. And so I volunteered.
Yeah.
Well,
but it is true, because it's there are generations sitting around, and I think it is why they sometimes say to the old guard, don't call us, we're doing it a different way. And so the old guard gets to understand, whether they're journalistic old guard or political party old guard. But as you say, if this is your team, and I don't mean in a partisan sense, but generationally, if this is your team and they can't deliver, then what? Because then that does erode belief in, trust in.
I mean, it's absolutely true that when I came to Ottawa in the 1990s, John Chrétien was the prime minister. He was, at that point, I think 60 years old. He was an ancient. Right. And most of the staff, including senior staffers to ministers, were in their mid to late 20s. It's always been a young person's game. It's exhausting. You can't have a life because you're so busy working your way through files. That doesn't change. So there's never been particularly a place for old folks, but sure, great. It's your time. Act like that. Deliver.
Yeah. But is it doable?
Become the stuff of legend. People always talk about how O.D. Skelton and Brooke Claxton built the modern civil service, 80 years ago. Mm. Do something comparable. Don't do something lame.
Yeah. But I think that's what people are waiting for. And I mean, the other thing is I'm just grabbing another one of your titles here because it was an interesting look at the electorate, not just political side, but there's no political reward for fixing what needs fixing. And so it doesn't get fixed.
Yeah, we're in a time of increasing partisanship and polarization. Another legacy of Trump's election in the United States. The election of a president whose views on a lot of things were more extreme than what had been accepted before, excited extremists on the right, and terrified a lot of people on the left, and led them to draw, I think, unhelpful conclusions, like you must never talk to or give any opportunity to the people who disagree with you because they're monsters who are going to build something terrible. So there's no room for compromise. There's no room for not even compromise. There's no room for a conversation that might open up some common ground. And I think the way that our political parties are funded now discourages accommodation and encourages alarmism. And in that partisan environment, you can't say, let's do things a little differently, because someone's going to scream at you, you know.
Which is just as true on the left as it is on the right. Stateside as well, we see.
It's true enough on every side. It's funny, I'm basically a cheerful person. I find myself sounding very pessimistic these days, and I don't think my personality has grown sour. I just think it's hard to look at recent trends in Western democracy and reach a different conclusion.
Yeah, no, I want to ask you about a couple of things, because you've been around long enough to know how issues like language in Quebec and culture in Quebec infiltrate every part of Ottawa's thinking, which is why there does seem to be greater and greater alienation out there in the parts for whom that is not their daily reality. What do you think they're going to do about Bill 96 and about Quebec's move? It seems much more toward the separatist ideals, even more so than René Lévesque used to promote them.
So Francois Legault, the Premier of Quebec, is an interesting cat. He's the first member from his party to become the Premier. He's center-right, almost sort of populist right on cultural matters, and came into politics. He's a businessman. He used to run an airline, but he came into politics through the Parti Québécois. So he at least used to present himself as a sovereignist. And there's a lot of people who think he's going to go back to just being a straight separatist. I asked Jean Charade about it in our interview, and my secret reason for it was because I've heard through the grapevine that Charade believes that Francois Legault wants to hold a sovereignty referendum. But with the microphone on, Charade didn't bite. Right. He didn't make that argument. The thing I know about Legault is that for a guy who has been an international businessman and has been involved in politics for 20 years, he doesn't know much about the rest of Canada outside Quebec. He's not interested. He has steadfastly refused every interview request I've ever put to him.
Yeah.
And he thinks that he's got a sense of what Quebecers vote for him and support him. And that tends to be Francophone Quebecers from outside the big cities. And he sees anyone who's not in that sort of voter pool and cultural support pool as probably trouble. So that includes immigrants. It includes Indigenous Quebecers. It includes Anglophones. And so he designs policies to lift up the kind of Quebecers who vote for him and elbow out the kind of Quebecers who don't vote for him.
Am I not right that he actually grew up on the West Island? Am I just?
It's true, but from one street to another in parts of the West Island. Like,
yeah. Okay.
It's
fair enough. Fair enough. Yeah.
Anyway, I do want to point out that when he pursues these policies, Bill 21, which is the no religious garb in the public service bill, has plenty of opponents among Francophone Quebecers. It's hardly unanimously supported, even among the people he thinks are his people. His language legislation has been criticized for being too soft, for being too tentative, too minimalist, and it's also been criticized for going way overboard. There's a lively debate about these things in Quebec, and I think part of Legault's eventual problem in politics is that his conception of even Francophone old stock Quebec is kind of too cartoonishly simplistic. And that sometimes at some point, the people he thought were going to be on his side will just not be on his side. But anyway, you asked about federal politics.
Yeah, I mean, I'm asking about their reaction to that. And because, people like to keep Quebec on side because it keeps them elected.
The thing that was striking about Bill 21, which is the religious symbols bill, is that the leaders of the parties had to be led by people lower down in the food chain. That it was not Aaron O'Toole who made it okay to debate that bill in the Conservative Party. It was Kyle Seaback, who I wouldn't notice if he walked by me, an Ontario Conservative MP. And similarly, Justin Trudeau was, he was leaving open the possibility that one day he might be critical of that bill, but he basically didn't have no stomach for it. And then almost his entire Quebec caucus, because most of them are Montrealers, with a pretty sophisticated urban electorate, they said, look, I sort of don't care what the boss thinks. I think it's a terrible bill. Yeah. And that sort of legitimized criticism of these cultural policies of Legault. There were some people who were worried about a backlash, that if English Canadians were too critical, that Quebecers would get their backs up.
Right.
But like I say, there's very few things that an English Canadian can say about Bill 21 or Bill 96 that Quebecers aren't saying among themselves already.
Yeah.
And so, anyway, it's a complex issue.
It is. Okay, I want to ask you a couple of things before we come to the end of this. What did you make of Bill Morneau? Was that just setting the record straight? Because he got a bit of a raw deal on the way out, so he came back.
He went out and he gave that speech. I mean, I'll tell you, I worked hard to get Bill Morneau to give me an interview instead of giving that speech to
okay, so that didn't work.
He had professional communications advice,
right,
which meant unimaginative people who couldn't imagine him doing something surprising. I do think Bill Morneau was a little bit more of an orthodox Chrétien-style liberal than Justin Trudeau wanted. But Morneau, especially early on, had 100 opportunities to make his positions known, and he didn't. He, like so many of the current Trudeau liberals, his problem was mostly that he was way too loyal and way too unquestioning, and right, that he permitted, along with his colleagues, not him all by himself, but the whole gang of them, permitted a governing culture of cheap consensus.
Never challenged.
Yeah, the healthy debate that used to be commonplace in the Liberal Party. The Liberal Party actually used to be
even his father allowed that.
What's that?
Even his father allowed that.
Yeah, well, this is it. And but now Bill Morneau's out in the real world, and he's trying to get some attention for. I hear he's got a book coming out. Good for him. All the best. I've written books. It's always good to be able to get some attention.
The other phrase that you have used, and I don't know what piece I read it in or where it was, but it's a phrase that really strikes me, and it goes to that point of your generally cheery self feeling a little down in the dumps these days, that we're witnessing, in addition to all these problems with political parties, the impact of that is the death of political authority. So that then when it matters, do you really turn to government? Do you believe in government? Do you trust them to solve the problems? If you lose that sense, just a few quick thoughts on that.
Well, we've seen what happens when people lose faith in government. They become much more likely to elect just sort of any random person to lead them. They start to reject not just policy directions, but the factual basis of political debate. They I don't want to believe your thing. I'm going to believe my own thing.
Yeah.
And the social contract starts to erode. I'll put up with you being different if you put up with me being different, and together we can still build a rule system that works for everyone. There's less of that. I think there's less of that than there used to be. And it's not even cheap nostalgia. There's a organization called Freedom House in Washington that puts out an annual sort of global audit of democratic rights and freedoms. And they find that since 2005, for 16 years in a row, that democratic rights have been receding in the world. Not only because China rises and Russia rises, but because in places where Democrats used to think they had friends, like Poland and Hungary and the United States and England, democracy has fewer friends than we used to think. And it's because it's a tougher world than it was 30 years ago. It's because there are big challenges like viruses and wars that I do wish Canadian governments would stick to their knitting a bit more and simplify what they're trying to get done and try and make sure that they actually get done the things they say they want to get done, rather than being essentially slogan machines.
And all things to all people.
Yeah, nobody's impressed.
Yeah. You said that you're getting off Twitter and you're going on Facebook and you're using obviously Substack, but this very technology that we use to have this conversation here today is part of that erosion of the belief in political institutions and authority. Is it just the way it is? Is it potentially a better thing, or is it bad any way you cut it?
I think everything's mixed. I used to really enjoy the free exchange of opinion on Twitter, but then it became a little more corrosive and I backed off. This teleconferencing software, I mean, I remember some legendarily terrible teleconferences that I was on before Zoom and Teams and stuff. Yes. You can casually get someone on a screen and sort of look at them and you have a meeting, and it's easier than driving downtown and finding parking, but the downside is what's lost. If I'm speaking to 40 people, I can't read the room. If if you have to send out a Zoom invitation to have a conversation, then that cuts down the sort of serendipity and happy coincidence that, walking around people. Downtown, you run into people, and it's real hard to run into people these days, So.
No, it really is that. I think we're just working our way through that. I mean, I'm one of those that believes the House of Commons and the Senate should be back with human beings interacting with human beings, because it makes a difference, and you can solve a lot more problems that way. Paul, this is really interesting discussion. I wish you all the best on this. I think it's you're just out there and you're trying it out and see what happens. And so say it one more time, Paul Wells.
Sure. You can find my subscription newsletter at paulwells.substack.com.
Okay, that's easy. All right. Well, thank you for this, and I hope we talk again soon.
So do I, and enjoy the rest of your summer.
Yeah, I'm really interested to see how this works, and the early signs are good, eh? 6,000 already. That's a good number. Really good number.
People are being really encouraging. So
yeah, you know him from Maclean's and all of that, but he's carving out some new turf in the political journalism world, and we're all going to be watching with interest. Thanks again.
Thank you. We'll talk again.
That's it for No Nonsense with Pamela Wallin.